Good morning. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We are here with Children Come First, as we are with it every week. And today we have a very, very special guest. He is Ted Sizer. And for those of you in education who I am sure are very familiar with the name Ted Sizer, Ted did a 5-year study of American high schools across the country and produced 3 books on the subject of his study. The first one was called Horace's Compromise, and we're going to have Ted talk a little bit about his research study, and then we're going to be talking about all of his books and his new books. Good morning, Ted.
Good morning.
Ted, what I'd like you to do first is to give us a little bit of background, if you will, and tell us about why you did this research and how it started, if you will.
Yeah, my professional career has moved back and forth between teaching and work in schools and in scholarship. I started my career as a teacher in the Army, and then taught in a school in Boston, and then a school in Australia. Then I switched to graduate work, leading to a PhD in American history and education. My interest there was on adolescence and schools, and my doctoral dissertation was on late 19th century American secondary schooling. From finishing my doctorate and teaching at Harvard, I moved to become Dean of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard during the 1960s. But in 1972, I decided to go back to schoolwork and became headmaster of Phillips Academy at Andover. So I had 9 years there, once again, among adolescents and seeing the work of schools close in and close up. And as a result of that experience, became more and more concerned that many of the basic ideas on which American high schools rested deserved serious challenge. And so I resigned my headmastership and headed a large research project called A Study of Schooling, the high school study, which where about 20 of us, full and part-time, looked very, very carefully at American high schools. And out of that research came 3 books. The one that I wrote, you mentioned Horace's Compromise. The compromises involved were, the necessary part of any job. No one of us can do any job in any setting without making compromises. And the trick, if you're going to be effective, is to make the right compromises, or the least damaging compromises. And what had persuaded us in the high school study was that the compromises that schools were making were, in many cases, the wrong compromises. The foundations that had financed the research came back to me and said, why don't you find some places, some school districts, some schools which have the courage and the freedom to set up different compromises, that is, to design their schools along the line of a more persuasive set of ideas than the ones that we had inherited from the late 19th century. And we organized a group called the Coalition of Essential Schools, which was the holding company for what is now over 1,000 schools that are struggling to remake themselves or redesign themselves to be more effective with kids. So I headed this enterprise, the Coalition of Essential Schools, while being a faculty member once again in higher education, this time at Brown. And I decided to retire when I was 65 and get involved with, you guessed it once again, a particular school, a brand new charter school started under the 1993 Massachusetts Reform Act near our home in central Massachusetts. It's called the Francis Parker Charter Essential School. It's now in its 5th year, and during its 4th year, my wife Nancy and I served as the acting co-principal. We also, in the last few years, we, meaning my wife and I, wrote and published a short book on what the trade calls moral education. For us, it turned around the metaphor of the students watching us adults. That is, watch the way we organize and run schools, watch the way we treat each other, watch the way we make some compromises and not others, on the assumption that all that watching leads to their learning about how to be a principled adult. So I've been very fortunate to be able in my professional career to oscillate back and forth between the world of research and study and the world of teaching kids in real schools.
Now, let's take a few steps backwards here because we're going to talk about all those different areas. Let's start with your study at Brown University, the 5-year study, and Horace's Compromise. Can you give our listening audience a little background? Let's take one book at a time.
Uh-huh.
What was the main premise of your book, Horace's Compromise, which, by the way, I recommend everybody should read? What was the basic premise of that book?
Well, I think the best way to describe it is to give very specific examples. A typical high school teacher in a suburban school may have as many as 110 to 140 students for whom he's responsible in a given semester. Let's say he has 120. Let's call him Horace Smith. Now, Horace Smith has the obligation and the intention of teaching each one of those youngsters to write well. Not only to write clearly, but also gracefully. And Horace Smith knows that the way that is done is by asking the students to write and to write again and to rewrite a 3rd time. And each one of those iterations, Horace himself will read and criticize and turn back. Now, this is a tremendous load. Let's say that Horace Smith allocated a minimal amount to what I've just described. That is 10 minutes a week for each youngster. 10 minutes spent by Horace to read and write over and turn back, and then at least once or twice a month talk at some length with each one of his students. Well, if you do the arithmetic, that's 20 hours. 20 hours is what it would take for Horace Smith to do that every week. 10 minutes a week per kid, 20 hours. As a result, of course, Horace Smith can't do that. And he doesn't do that. And the evidence from the research was that he does do that for kids at the extremes. The wonderful writer who is just a joy to talk with about her writing. And the other, the semi-literate kid who is just frightened and angry and unwilling to write. And the great mob in the middle, which my colleagues in one of the other books in the high school study called the unspecial majority, don't get much attention. And the result, of course, is large numbers of students graduating from high school who cannot write well at all. which is to say that a school which is organized so that Horace Smith cannot do his job is a school that's making the wrong compromises. That is, it's spending money in one way at the expense of Horace Smith's work. A typical high school has one full-time professional on its staff for every 14 students. So it's not that the people aren't there, at least in theory. It is that the adults are deployed in so many different ways that people teaching the core subjects, like Horace Smith teaching English, have such large student loads that they can't do the job well. And what our effort at Brown in the Coalition of Essential Schools was to figure out ways with our colleagues in schools, because no two schools are ever quite alike, how to make the job for the Horace Smiths possible, and at the same time keep these schools well-centered and lively and responsible places. It's easy to do, we've learned, on a piece of paper. It's fiercely difficult to do in the real world, because so many of the routines of high schools are so deeply embedded in the kind of American expectation of what a high school is, that to eliminate some of them in order that Horace Smith can do better causes political explosions. According as a result, a majority of the schools who try to pull this off are unable to do it, not because folks disagree with the objective or that they don't understand the compromise. It just is that they cannot bear to give up the cornucopia of good things which are crammed into the typical and lively comprehensive high school.
So because we are a society who has been ingrained for over 100 years in a certain mindset of how education should be and what the framework should be, what you're saying is it is rather difficult to change into a different mindset, which is the problem we're having with education today. You are listening to Children Come First. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We're here today with Ted Sizer, world-renowned for his book called Horace's Compromise, and the 5-year study called The Study of Schooling, done when he was at Brown University. Now, Ted, that moves us into the second book.
Mm-hmm.
Would you talk to us about the premise of the second book?
The second book is called Horace's School, and it was the story of a composite comprehensive high school which had gone through the process of examining itself and examining how it could limit the bad compromises which it had identified. The book arose from my experience from listening to and watching so many colleagues in these schools find their way to rearranging the resources in the school to serve kids better. And what I did is, as I had done with the earlier book in making a fiction character called Horace Smith, was to create a fiction school which was going through an analysis of where it was and then a design of what it might be. So in many ways it's a piece of fiction, but it's rooted in the experience of schools going through the process. I wrote the book largely because I realized how difficult this work was, how strenuous the opposition to real change was. And I thought it might help people who were struggling to do better by their students if they could draw from the experience of schools who had been through it and could understand that these kinds of reform efforts were not child's play. And somehow if you realize that it's going to be very difficult, it makes it less difficult. So the book is a kind of sober description of what I learned from my many colleagues in schools.
And the third book?
The third book is called Horace's Hope. And that was more of a meditation of my own on what we had learned in over a decade of experience. The first chapter is called A Story Where Nothing Happens. And it is a description of my visit 10 years later to one of the schools that I had visited in the early 80s as part of the study of high schools. And the rhetoric had changed, but the school hadn't changed at all. It was the same. This was an inner city school, and so it had its stresses from its situation. But it was a school which was fundamentally paralyzed by an interlocking set of competing interests of adult groups. So nothing had happened, except a certain language had changed, but nothing had happened. And the rest of the book really spins off of that with arguments, again, from matters that I had learned from the experience. For example, the extent to which, even in middle-class communities, whatever the high school does is swamped by the inattention and neglect of children, of adolescent children, by their families and guardians, and how even the most uncompromised school, if you will, has a heroic job in addressing the serious education of those kids because of the extent of their distraction and concern for their lives. The heart of the book is the fifth chapter, which is simply a recitation of what we've learned in a string of particulars, and the book ends with this kind of primal scream that it's about time the country took its adolescents seriously, and that rhetoric and finger pointing and humiliation is not going to improve the lives of kids and improve the quality of schools. It is going to take much more serious work than that. So in many ways, the book is mistitled. I am congenitally a hopeful person, but the difficulty of doing things which are blatantly obvious to do is very sobering. Nonetheless, there are lots of people out there, heroic people, all across the country in these schools, who will be damned if they don't have a serious shot at doing better what they're doing. And from them I draw very substantial hope.
Ted, could you explain to people what you mean by the shopping mall mentality?
The shopping mall mentality, the metaphor comes from one of the other books in the study of high schools called The Shopping Mall High School, Winners and Losers in the Educational Marketplace. It's written by Arthur Powell, Eleanor Farrar, and David Cohen. And their part of the research study was to spend almost 2 years with very careful observation and systematic observation of 15 high schools across the country, including 3 non-public schools, urban schools, rural schools, suburban schools. And what they saw was youngsters coming into these schools presented with a smorgasbord of opportunities. If you're interested in this, we will offer it to you. If you have this supposed problem, we will deal with it. We won't tell you, we won't push you very hard. We won't say you have to do this. We will say you have to make a choice. But if you don't want to work very hard, you can arrange things so you don't work very hard. And that is, you can go to the 5 and 10, the cheap store, and wander. On the other hand, you can go to the high-quality boutique, which expects much of you as a judge of the merchandise. The metaphor really says that in a lot of high schools, or certainly in these 15, my colleagues found it possible for a serious youngster or a typical youngster with serious parents to get a pretty demanding education. But the institution itself didn't insist on that. The institution itself had offerings of lighter demand, which the student could take, and all these kids would graduate at age 17 and 3/4 or 18 at once with a high school diploma that said the same thing on it. So you could do your shopping at a cheap store, or you could do your shopping at a rich store. It didn't make any difference. The school tacitly accepted that some people would work harder than others and was organized to accommodate that.
Can you tell us a little bit about expectations? You alluded to it earlier. What kinds of expectations do we have for our high school students?
Well, we're very confused. In the present day, the expectations have been pretty much put out there in most states as a series of questions on standardized tests. And the expectation is that you'll pass those tests. That is certainly an improvement over no expectations at all, except expectations that you showed up and didn't get into trouble. But in many ways, it's a very low quality expectation. In the school with which Nancy and I are now involved, which is very influenced by other schools in the Coalition of Essential Schools going back to the mid-'80s, the youngsters are shown examples of very demanding, high-quality work. And they and their families understand well from looking at it and seeing it what it is. It isn't just a score. It is a piece, for instance, to keep the English writing example going. It's a piece of writing that has depth and precision and style and a forcible message. So the expectation is you show that to the kid. You describe the skills and subject matter that you need to have in order to do that work. And then you do everything you can to get the kid to want to do it. It's really not rocket science. It's like a middle school basketball team. A lot of the kids probably haven't played much basketball. But you show them, you show them, and certainly the television in the month of March shows them, what first-class basketball is. They see, in other words, they have a clear sense of the target. And while none of them will be Michael Jordan, you can have the target in the high school gym, where older kids who do well can work with the younger kids. And very quickly, the boys and girls have a pretty good idea of what it is to be a consequential basketball player. We need the same kind, the same kind of expectations, clear and in terms that the student understands and appreciates in the basic academic subjects, and to be very explicit about it. If we want them to write well, they have to read essays which are not so beyond them that they just throw their hands up in despair, but give them a rigorous target at which to aim, that is, a target which they understand. So they have a sense of what they're shooting for.
Well, that's what has that got to do with standards? I mean, people would say to you that we have standards in our state, that these are our expectations. Are standards a high enough model for schools to elevate to? Or are you talking about something different?
No, I'm talking completely about standards. But there are many ways of expressing high standard work, only one of which is a calculated grade on a standardized test.
So you're talking about demonstrating measurement in a variety of ways rather than just an exam.
Exactly. If you want to know whether a youngster can write coherent and graceful prose, you have to look at that youngster's coherent and graceful prose. If the standard is high enough, you will not settle for just looking at the kid's first draft. That's what we do in most standardized tests. The really demanding standard in written English, which is essentially also a demanding standard in clear thinking and expression, is a piece of work that the kid has savored and has really put her mind to. That's a high standard. But let me shift away from writing for just a minute. In mathematics, the high standard isn't only the demonstration that you can make certain mathematical operations when presented with a familiar problem. The real key in mathematics, and all subjects in one way or another, is how you use what you've learned in an unfamiliar situation. That is, you're faced with a problem which is the likes of which you haven't quite seen before. And a good teacher will invent such a problem, knowing full well that the operations with which the student is familiar can be reorganized in such a way that the problem can be solved. The high standard, then, is the ability of the student to take what he's studied in the past, reconfigure it in such a form that the new and unfamiliar issue can be addressed.
Dr. Daria Brzezinski with Children Come First. We're here today with Dr. Ted Sizer,
the youngster really
who is the former Dean of Harvard Graduate School of Education,
the
former university professor at Brown University, the headmaster of Phillips Academy, and the founder of the Coalition of Essential Schools, and the author of
life
several
in the real
books
world
that
rarely comes at us
have
in
dramatically
highly
changed
predictable
education. Horace's
forms
Compromise,
that,
Horace's School, Horace's Hope,
that
each of which
correspond
talk about
directly with what we
education
learned
from
in
a
high school classroom.
fictional,
You are
non-fictional
listening
point
to
of
Children
view.
Come First. This is
And
Dr. Daria Brzezinski.
Ted
We're
and I
here
were
with
talking a
Dr.
little
Ted
bit earlier
Sizer,
about
who
the
has been Dean of
expectations, and I'm
Harvard
sorry I
Graduate School of
interrupted you, but I
Education,
wanted to make sure we
as
got
well
to
as,
our break.
the University
I had a
professor at Brown
question about
University. We'll be back for our second half hour as soon as we hear
standards
from
and
our
all that.
sponsors.
How do we motivate teenagers when we've got these? What motivates them to achieve these high expectations we have for them?
Oh, it's very hard. There's so many distractions in the world, and so many of those distractions involve less of a commitment on the part of the adolescent than hard work in school. My experience is that you have to take the kids one by one, and as what will gather your interest will be perhaps different than what will gather my interest and commitment. And the only way you can do that in a school is to have each teacher with a small enough group of kids so that this one-by-one inspiration can at least be attempted. That's why in all our school designs there is an intense focus on getting the load per teachers down, so that not only they can read the students' papers each week, but also because they can find out where the energy is in the kid's life and seize the best of that effectively.
So do you promote small schools as well as small class size?
Small schools, small loads per teacher, small classes, absolutely.
What kind of numbers are we talking about? What numbers are we talking about?
Well, in the school where Nancy and I work, or have worked, which I should say up front does not have as much money behind it per student as a typical high school in our region. That is less well funded than a typical high school. No teacher has more than 65 students for which he's responsible, and most have 50 or fewer. And that is done by having a very focused curriculum and a very simple program. 50 kids, and the same 50 in June that you started with in September, so that you really have a run with a kid.
You don't mean 50 in the class?
No. In a typical situation at the Parker School, there would be two of us teaching 25 kids. Let's say you're a math teacher, I'm a science teacher, we would teach together. And then we'd have another 25 kids. And so the two of us together would be responsible for the math and science of those 50 kids.
Do you teach core curriculum in your schools?
Well, yes, it's very narrow curriculum. It's a cluster. It's two big clusters. Mathematics, science, and technology are taught by a faculty drawn from those disciplines in an interconnected way when that makes sense, and particularly for older kids in a more traditional disciplinary way. The other major area is arts and humanities, including Spanish. We offer one language, and everyone takes it, Spanish. And the English, the fine arts, history, government, music is again orchestrated in a careful way by a faculty drawn from those various disciplines. And particularly for the younger kids, is taught by pairs. That is, I, the history teacher, would be paired with a English teacher or a music teacher. But both of us would feel a responsibility for the serious learning in the humanities and arts of each one of the kids.
Now, what year was it that you started the Essential Schools movement?
Well, the Parker School, as I say, it's in its 5th year. The Parker School very much reflects, in many ways, the grandmother of the small schools in the coalition of essential schools, which was Central Park East Secondary School in East Harlem in New York, which was the grand dream of Deborah Meyer, one of the great educators of our time. And she brought in that inner city school the numbers way down, a highly focused curriculum, a very demanding set of assessments, as the kids have to exhibit their work publicly. That school has been going long enough so that the quite extraordinary record of its students now is fully understood by the public. There's enough experience now to know that while what we're describing is difficult to pull off, and so far has only been able to be pulled off in schools of choice, because the expectations for the students and the teachers are so different than the typical shopping mall high school that some families will balk at it, so that their charter schools are their schools of choice, such as in District 4 in East Harlem, or they are separate small high schools, such as Fenway High School in Boston, Boston Arts, Boston Evening Academy. There are dozens of these schools now, but they tend to be schools where kids are admitted by lottery, schools where no particular child is forced to attend.
What are you said these are essential schools, it's the Coalition of Essential Schools. What are the essentials that you prescribe?
Every child known well, every child moving forward on the basis of clear and demanding performance by that child, a program of studies which is the hardcore of the best of important knowledge. Some people would call it the basics. And the schools are themselves very self-conscious places. That is, they, in their very functioning, teach thoughtful habits, and that people aren't anonymous, that people treat each other well, that people routinely expect evidence for assertions that they and others make. So they're very self-conscious, small, focused, performance-driven institutions which concentrate almost exclusively on the basic intellectual skills which everyone in this economy and society has to have.
One of the members, I believe, of your study from Brown University also wrote a book, which the title eludes me at the moment, which was in retrospect talking about the basic curriculum in American high schools and how it hasn't changed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it goes back to my earlier career. My doctoral dissertation, which turned into a book, was on the report of the Committee of 10, which was a group of college presidents and school people in 1893 who identified what they call the mainline subjects: English, mathematics, foreign language, history, and science. And they decreed that these subjects would be taught separately, and the children would move forward in their study on the basis of time. That is, half year for this, or a full year for that, 2 years for the other thing. These mainline subjects are so embedded in our thinking that the schools, people designing new schools will instantly say, well, there's a social studies department, there's an English department, there's a science department, there's a math department. And as though those were a kind of immutables.
The sacred cows.
Something that you can't break away from.
The sacred cows of our culture.
Exactly. Even though the most interesting major research universities like Brown are changing the contours of those disciplines and clusters of those disciplines as we speak. But the people responsible for secondary education assume that those are fixed, even as anybody who looks carefully at the nature of those disciplines knows they're in constant movement, and it's paralyzing.
Now, you said you take the curriculum in clusters in your schools, in your essential schools. Actually, that probably is the best resolution, I would think, for changing people's mindset about how learning really takes place, because everything we have is integrated. It's not a chopped up, secluded sort of curriculum. It's rather learning takes place by integrating various stimuli.
Right. I mean, an example, our school, Parker School's on an old Army base. It is situated next to the Nashua River, which flows through the Army base. The Nashua River, until the last 25 years, was terribly polluted, and it's going through a really quite remarkable process of cleansing, of being cleansed and cleansing itself. Now, the kids do studies of water samples, of soil samples, of at different places as the river goes through different parts of the base, and they are asked to draw conclusions about the wildlife and aquatic life there, the chemistry of soils and the water. At the same time, they're asking questions of why is it this way? What is it about who lived on this river that caused the changes in the soil chemistry? And the step beyond that is the step to economics and politics. People 50 years ago knew they were poisoning the soil. Why did they, in their best judgment, not stop poisoning it? Why did they feel that that perhaps there was so much land out there that you could afford to befoul some portion of it? And that pushes, of course, back into history. So, just that one example drawn from work our kids have done shows how the real world is a very complicated place, and it doesn't chop into nice, hermetically sealed little subjects like soil chemistry, which has no beginning and no end.
You are listening to Children Come First. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We're here today with Dr. Ted Sizer, who is the former dean of Harvard Graduate School of Education, former headmaster of Phillips Academy, and former professor at Brown University, and the founder of the Coalition of Essential Schools, who is now, I believe, headmaster of the Parker School.
No, my wife and I were the acting principal for a year, and we're now teaching again at Harvard and being trustees of the Parker School.
Is Nancy in the room yet?
Yes, she is.
Can we have a little conversation with her as well?
Yeah, let me make sure. Let me get her on the phone.
All right, we'll be talking with Nancy Faust Sizer, who is wife of Dr. Ted Sizer, who with him has participated in many of the functions.
Hello?
Hi, Nancy. I was just telling people that you've been a classroom teacher for 25 years in the public and private sector, and you've also supervised with your husband the Parker School.
Mm-hmm.
with him. What can you tell us about, you both have a new book that's out called The Students Are Watching, Schools and the Moral Contract. Can you tell us a little bit about that book and what you mean by students are watching?
Yes, we have been interested in moral education for a long while as teachers and as parents, and always imagined that much of it would happen in conversations with students, either one-on-one or in groups in classrooms. But as we went forward in our careers, and Ted got very interested in school design, and I went around and saw more schools. Usually teachers, only know their own students. They only know their own school. But I had the chance to look at quite a number of other schools because I was with him. And we began to see that the very environment of a school, the various decisions that are made in it, the way people are toward each other, how much they rely on rules, whether they had any say in developing the rules of the environment. All of that is a lesson, is something which is actively teaching kids what we value and how we want to be toward each other. And a lot of the time, I think in high schools, we're teaching the lessons we wish we weren't teaching. We're teaching the lesson of hurry up, get it done, doesn't matter if it's very good. Or we're teaching the lesson of the fact that order is more important than the really important development of an idea by interrupting classes in order to get the cheerleaders out on time to the bus. To skip school, essentially, by going off to some sport. And we began wondering, how many lessons are there in a given day that a kid has to absorb, and then the parents or the teachers say, oh no, that's not what we wanted you to conclude. And so we began thinking about what is the raw material that a kid is actually exposed to. And much of it is decision of, it's a sort of semi-decision. In other words, we need to save money, so we'll give this teacher 150 students to monitor, and then we'll be angry at her that she doesn't really know them well. Those aren't really decisions, it's just that they've happened. So that's really what we meant by students are watching.
All right, now, can you define moral education? Because I'm sure everyone out in our listening audience has a different definition of what they consider moral education to be. What would you consider moral education?
For me, it's a matter of determining what your values are and which of your values are the most important. What seems most right to you to do, and you would for sure do with your life. This is your own personal code, your own personal decision as to how you will act and what you will, and how you came to think what you think, how you would defend what you think and what you do. Which ones are the most important, and which ones do you feel good about at the end of the day, glad you stuck with, and which ones are you looking back and wondering if they were really very wise? I think everybody does it. I know that a lot of people don't think some other people do it. I know that we aren't great at talking about it, but I think it's a part of life. We were made to be that kind of person. What do you think, Ted?
I would put a different spin on the same point. It's ultimately about a habit of thoughtfulness. That is, you get into the habit of withholding your judgment, often briefly, often for a while, to say, what's going on here? Why does this person make this argument? If I respond, what are the costs to that person and to the other person? It's a kind of a sophisticated habit arising from the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's all necessarily immediate, that none of us humans has a kind of cosmic philosophy about the good and the evil from which we pluck understandings for each particular situation. It's rather the other way around, that you're confronted with something. You're confronted with a tragedy. You're confronted with a wonderful thing that you want to recognize. And what you have to do, in our view, as a principled person in the real world, is to have the habit of pausing, reflecting, and figuring out how your response can serve the best possible purpose.
Well, I would say that Americans are not the delayed gratification society that your ideal is speaking about, our fast-paced, immediately in need of response. And, this is not the America that we're living in today and the values and integrity that you're talking about are not something that is emulated, especially with our number one mode of communication, which is the television and or the radio as well, and our newspaper and many of the other kinds of literature that our children read. How do we overcome society? And I mean, just look at what happened with the president. All of a sudden extramarital affairs is not necessarily condoned, but we get a slap on the wrist and we go on. So this is a very different society than 50 years ago.
This is true, but I don't think we should hold ourselves up to the absolute ideal of every single person acting in the most principled way, or else we won't even play. I think what we have to introduce to the students is the fact that you can get closer to such an ideal, and that, it will be something that you will do during your lifetime. I mean, there are people that tend to become more responsible by the time they're 25 than they were when they were 15, and they tend to see the world in slightly larger terms, that other people's rights matter, and that you can bring them into consideration when you're about to act. And we need to enjoy and honor the small progress that each of us could make, and do a little more talking without preaching. That's the problem. You have to figure out how to do it. About what ultimate values are. And I used to do it in my history classes. That way I didn't have to preach a sermon, but we could still get at the issues of value, which were behind various people that we studied, what their ultimate goals were. And I don't know, I don't believe in getting too discouraged by what is all around us. I think there's moral lessons to be learned in a lot of places, and possibly a very nuanced.
We school people can do more than we're doing. For example, college admissions. The students usually have to write an essay describing themselves to the college. It's to be a personal essay, but the English department checks it out. Student is supposed to put together a list of things that she has done at school. So if she wasn't the vice president of enough clubs, she rushes off and becomes the vice president of a club. There are tests to take, SATs or ACT tests, and what you do is get a book or hire Stanley Kaplan of the Princeton Review to drill you in how to master the test, not so much to master the subject matter as to master the test-taking tricks. Now, all of this teaches brilliantly a curriculum in manipulation.
And cynicism.
And cynicism.
And seeming to be more than you are. And it's and adults without meaning to tell the kids, this is the game, you're going to have to play it right now. And sometimes they say, do this because it'll look good on your CV. Adults say this. And I think we have to stop doing that. We have to concentrate on what is really there in a child. We can do that, too, in school, by having them learn how to present themselves earlier and more honestly when they're in 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade. Then it won't be such a shock when they do it in 12th grade.
Some of the parents
the students are watching, the kids are watching us, whether we're the President of the United States or whether we are big shot business leaders or whether we are athletes. The kids see that if you're in a prominent enough position, forgiveness appears to come more rapidly than if you're not. the kids look at the evidence about who's in jail and who isn't, who is executed, and who isn't, which schools get more money than other schools.
But then they look at a Republican governor like the one in Illinois, who has all his life believed in capital punishment, who suddenly has a terrible crisis of confidence and conscience, in which, because he's noticed that certain kinds of people seem to be executed faster than others, and he's beginning to think about DNA evidence, which means that he's broadening his criteria and his reason for evidence, and he politically is going to take a hit on this, but he feels it's right. And we can talk about that kind of politics, too.
I never thought of it that way. Probably the governor of Illinois did more for school reform and social studies in Illinois schools by that single act than almost anything else he could have done.
Well, he may be right, he may be wrong, but the fact is that he is very earnestly trying to do what we're really all trying to do, which is to be as fair as possible with this very intricate problem of some people being truly harmful and even evil in our world, people that have murdered. I mean, that's a very, very bad thing. I don't think it's something that should be forgiven exactly. I just think that this is a man who was exercising his conscience at his own peril, and we could look at him and we could learn, and maybe we agree, maybe we don't, but we could at least look at a person who does that. And I think there are people doing that every day. I think there's the dry cleaner guy who brings you back here, who tells you that you just gave him more money than you needed to, and it's a small act, but he's done it. And I think we could point out those things too. There are a lot of very decent people in our country, and we can learn from them.
The emphasis seems to be to the contrary, though, in terms of, I'll just give a slight example that I've used before, and that is mom and dad are telling their children to be honest and not to steal, and come home with, as the children observe, pens and pencils from work and using the copy machine at work when the boss isn't looking. So, we give these mixed messages to our children and then wonder why they're confused or wonder why they go out and steal something from a store.
Yep, that's right. As a parent, you're just constantly saying to yourself, is this what I want my children to conclude? Last summer we were camping on a river, and we knew where the campsite was, but it was full of other people, and it was 8-10 miles to the next campsite. And we asked the man who was patrolling the river, can we camp somewhere near, since we can't camp on it? And I kept thinking, what are our grandchildren going to think as they watch us negotiate this? Are they going to think we're trying to get away with something? Are they going to think we're just going to be slimy and do it anyway? He said you have to check out with the neighbors, and we made a good faith effort to do that, but they weren't there. And I just remembered thinking, now what shall we do? Shall we stop and discuss all this with the kids so they see what we're going through? We're trying to do the right thing, and we're trying to do, the right thing for them too. They were all exhausted, of course. It's good, though. I mean, it's troubling, but it's the way to help them to realize that we have this side to ourselves, the side which would like to do the right thing, and that's what I mean by moral education.
You have been listening
to the front of our book.
You have been listening to Children Come First. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We were here today with Dr. Ted and Dr. Nancy Sizer, who have recently written a book called The Students Are Watching. If you'd like to reach us, you can call us at toll-free 877-PRO-KIDS. That's 877-PROKIDS. Or email us at PROKIDS, PROKIDS, at RLC.net. Again, our phone number, 877-PRO-KIDS. That's 877-PRO-KIDS. And we'd like to thank Dr. Theodore Sizer and Dr. Nancy Sizer for joining us today with Children Come First. Join us again next week for our program.
Thank you very much.